board today for our colleagues in Asia. So once again, thank you so much everyone for joining International Women's Day at Bonhill for 2021. We are all virtual this year. I would love to be in the office with you all talking about these things, but thank you for taking the time out of your day and for participating in our week-long campaign. It's been great so far and there's lots more to come. Today is all about getting women into leadership, and one of the UN's 2021 themes for International Women's Day is about women in leadership and looking for an equal future post-COVID. And so that's what our panel are going to be talking about. And actually, this isn't just about talking about getting women into leadership. This is about all women, including women of color, including women with disabilities, LGBTQ plus women, women from all generations, women of all faiths and none, and ensuring that you all know what your role could be in getting marginalized voices to the top. So without further ado, I am going to introduce our magnificent panel today. I'm actually going to ask them to do a quick introduction of themselves, and then for each of them also to just tell us maybe what their favorite thing about International Women's Day is, or what they're most excited about for International Women's Day. So I'm very first going to come to Ashanti, who is here with us as total diversity and inclusion expert. So Ashanti, welcome.
Welcome. Thank you so much for having me. It's lovely to be here. So my name is Ashanti, and I'll start by saying what my favourite thing is about International Women's Day. I think that this is a day that I probably, as I've gotten older, have come to appreciate more. I think, and what I've particularly enjoyed this year is so many, as you say, different kinds of women sharing their experiences, but also sharing how they're going to choose the challenge this year, because it really is a choice. It's a brave choice as well. And so for me, it's been an honor really to be able to hear people's plans, you know, for the future and what it is they wish to add to their world, their community, and of course their workplaces.
Amazing. Thank you so much for sharing, Ashanti. I'm going to pass over now to Amanda Brock, who's here, who is a true woman in leadership herself. Amanda, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for having me along today. I'm Amanda Brock. I'm CEO at Open UK. We're an industry organisation representing open technology, so open source software, hardware, data across the UK. I've had many International Women's Days, and I think what I like best about it is the fact that we take a pause and we're really present in the celebration of ourselves and each other. And I think increasingly we see that expanding out not just to women, but to our allies and to our other colleagues, and a general sense of belonging, which I think is very important.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you, Amanda. I'm going to hand over to Mike now. Mike also has his own organisation and is an ally in this conversation. So Mike, welcome.
Thank you. It's an honour to be here. Such a great panel at a really important time. So yeah, I'm Mike. I'm a futurist, speaker, entrepreneur. I've co-founded a couple of companies, one that's about accelerating innovation for the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Another which is about improving humanity's adaptability, which plays an important part in this topic, I think. And I'm also a chapter founder and trustee at a charity called Journeyman, which is about removing toxic masculinity in the mentorship of young people. I'm a qualified naturopath, yeah, as I said earlier, a Global Goals ambassador. Also a proud and humble partner and husband of a double-term HR director at the Obama administration. And yeah, for this, for International Women's Day, I think it's the time to be challenged and the time to challenge, certainly for men, and to drive the conversation, as well as celebrate amazing women. So thank you very much for having me here.
Thank you for that, Mike. Thank you so much. And last but very not least, Ria is here. Ria is a superstar, is a young woman who's already founded a couple of companies during high school education, I believe. But Ria, I'll hand over to you now. Welcome again.
Founded a company called Smart Cane, and it's an assistive device for orientation and mobility to help the visually impaired. And I'm really interested in the health tech space and work at Deloitte Digital as well, developing a fall prediction tool for seniors. And one of the most exciting things for me about International Women's Day is getting to hear the conversations from both sides of the table, both men and women, to kind of contemplate how we can build a better future right now. And I'm really excited to hopefully give a youth perspective into this and getting more young women in leadership.
Amazing, Ria. Thank you so much. So that's our panel. I hope everyone's very excited to hear what they have to say. I'm going to just head straight in. So for anyone that's just joined us, welcome. Today's panel is about getting women into leadership. So to get started, let's look at women in leadership. So in 2019, the figure for women in senior management roles rose to 29% globally, and that figure stayed the same in 2020. That's according to Catalyst data. Now, if we look at Fortune 500, 7.4% of their CEOs are women. If we look at the FTSE 100, I believe it's 6 women are CEOs and no women of color as far as I'm aware. So those stats aren't great, if we're honest. I suppose the question is, why are we not making the progress we want? What's going wrong in this space? Amanda, I'd actually like to come to you first, if you don't mind, on that one, to think about, you know, what we're maybe not doing right.
Yeah, it's a tough one actually, because there are plenty of very, very talented women out there, and I meet them and I work with them all the time. I think there's a little bit of ownership we need to take ourselves, probably on 2 fronts. First of all, on accepting the challenge and really going for it. And I know that the women on this panel have, but we often encounter, I suppose, imposter syndrome and our own blockers. You know, I have a thing on my fridge that says, a magnet that says, the only person who can stop me is myself. And it's absolutely true, because if you go for it, you are really going to have so much more chance of achieving it than if you sit there and you think, oh, well, you know, I'm looking at a job description and I can do 8 out of 10, but those 2 better not apply. My experience personally is that men will apply almost the opposite way around. Sometimes I'm flabbergasted at what they think they can do. And I think we need a bit more of that chutzpah. We just need to take it on and lose a little bit of the fear and not be afraid to challenge. I think the second piece is that as we progress, it's really important to keep giving back. I'm very conscious of that with the team that I work with and the volunteers I work with in Open UK. And I constantly push them and women I see around me to take those challenges. And I think sometimes that's all they need, that little bit of encouragement. And we really have to own that.
Yeah, that's great. And actually that speaks a lot to, I know something that Mike and I discussed last week around, there is this idea of the confidence gap, and there is an important distinction as well between not putting the expectancy on women to change themselves in order to get there, but being aware of, you know, the many issues at play. Mike, I wonder if you maybe want to elaborate a little on that, that, you know, what we discussed last week around confidence and that gap.
Yeah, sure. I think it's something that I've seen with the guardians and parents that we work with at Journeyman as well, where there is this confidence gap, and it's almost like we're sort of eroding the confidence of our younger women and empowering the younger men. And you know, to take an example that I remember of, there was a mother who had, you know, a son and a daughter. Both would come home with a score of 85 out of 100, and she would be almost asking, why aren't you doing better, to her daughter, and congratulating the son. And that seems to be repeated more so and more so. And, and then we see it play out in the workplace. I think, there was a HP report that they did internally, and it was showing that men were putting themselves forward for promotions and leadership positions when they only had 50 to 60% of the skills they required. Whereas women were waiting until they had 100%, even 120% of the requirements. So it's almost this underestimation versus overestimation that's completely imbalanced. And it exists from cradle to career. It really does. It's like a tax almost.
Mike, I would add to that, sorry, Jenna, just the very fact that we're having this conversation, and a lot of women hopefully will listen to it. Imposter syndrome was pointed out to me in my 40s, and I hadn't even heard of it before. And I was basically told, you're either really suffering from imposter syndrome or you are playing on this, stop playing on it. And it was purely imposter syndrome in my case, but I hadn't even heard the term. And I think we need to really, really own this and help support girls to understand why and how they feel, and to help them not be like that as time goes by.
And that's a great point, actually. I'd like to tie that point in and come to you, Rhea, because this is a conversation that's evolved. If we're talking specifically about gender progress here, the conversation has evolved over years. And as you said, Amanda, it's something that you were only made aware of later in life, as a professional. Rhea, is it something that you think about? You're obviously a young woman, and you have the workplace ahead of you. So I wonder what your thoughts are on your position in that, and where we might be going wrong.
Yeah, for sure. I think I've definitely experienced imposter syndrome as well. And like Amanda, I didn't hear about it until the last few years when the term was coined. So I think a lot of young women face it, especially. And I think a lot of the internal barriers that we set for ourselves are kind of triggered, especially when your mindset's forming when you're young. The education system hasn't evolved at all almost in the last few decades, which is crazy because we've just seen an exponential shift in our reality in the world. Like, we don't have a leadership course or anything, or learn how to file our taxes, or learn how to navigate the world as a young woman in technology. And I think one of the biggest problems that kind of sets that imposter syndrome in place is that even in like robotics clubs or anything in schools, you're often one of the only girls. And I think that's rooted in that ambiguity that surrounds the tech atmosphere, because we don't really know what happens inside those buildings, and we're not exposed to it at all. There's very little technology in school curriculums in the first place, even though it is one of the biggest drivers of change. And I think that ambiguity kind of discourages girls, especially because we kind of perceive that it's a male dominated industry. And because of that, I think we're underqualified if we don't learn about technology in high school or middle school, like a lot of male counterparts do. So I think that kind of really sets the stage for that feeling of not being able to achieve certain things, especially in industries that you're foreign to, and thinking that, oh, if I start learning this in university, it's too late, even though it isn't. So I think that's one of the biggest things. And I really hope that this sense of community that we're building, especially on days like International Women's Day, can bring people together and show them that imposter syndrome is a very common among a lot of young girls, and it's okay to feel. And that's one of the things that helped me get through it, by talking to other young leaders in the space and hearing that they experience similar things. So I think by fostering the sense of community where a lot of women can support each other and help each other grow is one of the biggest things that we can do to combat this and combat those internal barriers that we set for ourselves, so that we can continue to push those boundaries about what's possible to learn and create within the realms of our curiosity.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And I think that's really relevant about what you can see, what you're exposed to, and even in marketing and advertising and communications. And Rhea, I know you work in the tech space, And you know, we constantly see coding courses on posters, and it's all men and young boys that are on the posters, and you know, that doesn't set the right tone to start to change even what industries look like, never mind what leadership looks like. So thank you for sharing. Ashanti, I want to come to you here, because something that we've also been talking about is COVID's impact on, you know, what the future of women in leadership and marginalized voices in leadership look like, and where that issue is. And we've seen, you know, flexible working benefits for you know, maybe working parents, working carers, people with disabilities. It's been a benefit for certain individuals, but we've also maybe taken a few steps back in the realm of unpaid care work, landing on the doors of women maybe more. And I suppose my question is, you know, what impact has COVID had on the scene of gender equity, and you know, maybe what systemic elements are there in there that we need to be aware of and be talking about?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. And the reality quite often of a crisis is that it reveals culture, essentially. So if the existing culture was really healthy, open, transparent, communicative, in a crisis, generally speaking, stakeholders and individuals will lean upon that existing culture as their guide to navigate this crisis, because, you know, it's tough and it's unpredictable, and there are going to be tough conversations and decisions to make about your business, about the workforce, etc. And not everybody will be happy about all of those conversations and decisions. And so what we saw over the last 12 months is the collision of a crisis, as well as any pre-existing cultures that existed within organizations that may not have been as inclusive, embracing. They may well have actually been quite hostile to certain groups within the workforce. And so that's how COVID has really just shone a light more than anything on existing culture and way of doing things, as opposed to changing the way things are. It just shone a light on maybe some of the areas that organizations can start to shift, essentially.
And this is kind of a question to anyone, but I suppose, you know, off the back of what Ashanti's been talking about, and, you know, cultural change, and we've become aware, you know, we've had to stop and think. In terms of, you know, what's next, the next 6 months, the next 12 months, what changes do you think we will see? I'm not going to say as we return to normal, because no one can long-term predict anymore. But as we start to kind of unwind, what big cultural changes do you think we will see from organizations? I don't know if anyone has any thoughts on that.
I have a thought that's a slight sideline on this, and picking up on what Ria was saying about education and getting girls into STEM, and a little bit on what Ashanti was saying about culture. One of the real problems we've seen in the UK, and I believe that we've seen across the globe, with children staying at home and not being able to go to school, is their education and their access both to devices and to data. And that digital inclusion has been absolutely critical. It's terrible that it's been the way it's been, but I think actually it's one of the silver linings is that it's now being addressed head on. And in terms of things like social mobility and access to education, it's absolutely critical that it is addressed. So from my organizational perspective, last year we did a kids camp teaching children digital skills and coding. We gave away 3,000 glove kits. This year we're going down a different path for our giveaway, and we're trying to ensure that we're following that path of digital inclusion, which we were a little bit careless about. I'm slightly ashamed of that, but we were last year. So I think there's a good thing coming out of this, that we're raising awareness and we're dealing with these issues.
Yeah, and that's a great point actually, Amanda, because it's this element that we've kind of had time to stop and think, and actually, you know, had not to put a positive spin on you know, a pandemic, but looking at some of the silver linings that society has been able to draw from this, would we have ever had this time to stop and think and maybe make those changes and really reflect on what might need changed? So it's great to see that, you know, in some spaces and in many spaces there are positive changes being made, particularly when it comes to inclusion. I want to move on a little bit to talk about intersectionality, for anyone joining us that might not be aware of the term of intersectionality, we see a lot of gender quotas being put in place, 30% of women on boards by this date, and a lot of policies around increasing gender representation. However, those statistics, as we touched on earlier, that representation really falls behind when it comes to, for example, women of colour. And there are compounding identities that people have. They're not just in a block of gender and race and disability representation. And so I suppose, Ashanti, maybe I want to ask you, because you are somewhat of a trailblazer in the diversity space. Where race and gender and other elements interact and intersect, what can we do? Why is the equity conversation not progressing in the same way in those spaces?
Yeah, well, the first thing is really we need leaders within organizations to be willing to be self-aware and willing to actually acknowledge that there is an issue in and itself. So some of those statistics that you shared about gender parity, they are, the actual number is 0% for women of colour across any sector in the UK. And it has been that for quite some time. Any global reports that cover workplace culture and attitudes and gender diversity, women of colour and any other intersection are but a byline or a footnote. Okay, so as a group, they're not being recognised within the workplace as it is. And so one of the key things that I really encourage is for leaders who touch the recruitment process, the hiring process, but also the talent development experience of employees within the organizations, is to actually educate themselves and become a little bit more self-aware about some of the systemic issues that may exist, and really work towards diminishing the impact of those systemic inequalities on individuals in the workplace who maybe represent intersectionality. And so that is something that's quite important to do, because to put it into context, the UK economy, for example, could unlock £24 billion if it invested in women of colour. That is huge. That is an underutilized resource right now that exists within our industries. And so it is a difficult conversation to have, and it can be quite complex. And so one of the things we really hope leaders are willing to do is be brave, be vulnerable, which I know is the exact opposite to what they've been rewarded for in terms of qualities as leaders. But it is to have these discrete conversations to explore systemic inequality and what that is, and how they can diminish the impact that some of the systems and processes they may have within their organizations are having on these minority groups in the workplace.
Yeah, and you touched there, Ashanti, on a couple of, it's uncomfortable, but it's an education, and it's an education and a self-awareness activity. And, the statistics that we shared around, who's in leadership, we need allies to really actively want to educate themselves. It would be easy to sit back and just look at the statistics and not do much, but you're right, it is a leadership responsibility to say, okay, this is my identity, this is where I am, these are the identities I'm leading. And I suppose, as I use the word ally there, Mike, I'd love to ask you on this question, and think about the role of men as allies to women, how men can use their privilege in society, their power in the workplace that they have in getting women and all marginalized groups, elevated. So I'd love to come to you on that one.
Yeah, thank you. I think that either you're in one of two camps. You either haven't shown up to the conversation, or as a man, or you're a latecomer, to certainly to gender equality and discrimination. And that idea that you shared about looking in the mirror sometimes is really difficult, and not very good at finding that that vulnerability, accessing that vulnerability to do that. And there's a balance, because I'm also, I guess, as a man, very aware of the belief from some corners that men being part of the conversation and solution just reinforces that patriarchal notion, that only men who are leaders can make the difference, and that puts men on a pedestal for being engaged in promoting gender equality. And so it's there is a real balance to be found. And essentially I just believe that we embrace identity through the stories that we're told all through our lives. And we're still socializing kind of an achievement gap in minorities, and again this confidence gap in women, and it's just to the absolute detriment of business.
Yeah.
It's to the detriment of society and social benefit, but in business it's all proven. There are incredible statistics to prove how better a company performs, how happier employees are, how happier customers are when there's gender balance, especially at leadership level. And I don't know, if I'm honest, why those statistics are being lost. Why aren't they being acted on? And really forward-thinking quotas put in place. And there's places like California are doing some good things, moving in the right direction. But we believe what we hear, and it's just a self-fulfilling prophecy, isn't it, of loss of potential.
Yeah, and it reminds me of, because we hear about the business case a lot. I'm particularly immersed in the space of diversity and inclusion, but for anyone here who isn't, it's talked about a lot, the business cases there. But there's also another part of that conversation where there is the human case, and there is an idea of what we need to have both. We need to know that the human case is sufficient actually for doing things, including people, because that is the right thing to do. But also understanding that there is a business case for it. We can't ignore that. It's as Ashanti shared, the amount of resource that's being lost, even financially, by not really kind of grasping.
And if I could just add to that, because I think, Mike, you made some really interesting comments about the seat at the table that men have and whether they should be a part of these conversations. The reality is that the modern workplace is hostile to the modern man as well. There is this myth that men are completely happy at work and absolutely enjoying society and all of its spoils, and that isn't true for the modern working man either. The workplace largely is broken. The generation for which it was originally created no longer exists. And so there is a conversation about men who are self-aware, men who would like to add support to the overall progress of the workplace being there. But of course, there is a skill as an ally to any particular cause about holding space as opposed to taking up space. And that is just a balance that I think really intuitive male leaders will strike. In addition to that, we also have to be aware of the fact that HR as a function is so critical in many organizations. And often what's quite forgotten is that it's 83% white and female. So this idea that men are the only allies that can exist in the workplace to improve female progression is also flawed, because 83% of the functions that touch recruitment, talent development, are made up of white female professionals. And so there is something within that group of enabling, upskilling them so that they can, to Amanda's earlier point, give back, pay it back, so that we can bring more women up the ranks of all kinds.
And I love that. I love the way you worded it, Ashanti. It is that balance between being an ally but not taking up the space, being that kind of facilitating and supporting without overstepping and speaking for. I'd love to move on to the next question, if everyone wouldn't mind. I want to come to Ria. If anyone has noticed, for once it is sunny in the UK, and I have been slowly trying to move out of the blinding sunlight. So if anyone is noticing my subtle movements, that's what's happening, in case I was distracting you. But to move on, Ria, now Gen Z, Gen Z and millennials, they're the leaders of tomorrow. They're the incoming workforce, the incoming leaders and chief execs and senior managers. And I just want to ask you for, what your perspective is. In a way, you're already a woman in leadership. You've co-founded companies and you're smashing all sorts of ceilings. But I want to, just maybe get your perspective on, your path that you see in the future as we're talking about, the barriers that various marginalized groups face.
Yeah, for sure. I think, as young people, like I said, the tech industry is quite ambiguous. So I think in the future, what could help is exposure, offering exposure to young people, either from companies or bringing in speakers to schools could actually make a huge difference. Because what I found growing up was that usually when schools brought in speakers from all of these different industries, kids would often get excited about asking those questions and pursuing potential careers in that field. And the second thing that I want to say is something that's really helped me as like a young woman in leadership, and I still have a lot to learn, is mentorship. So, and I think that also touches into Ashanti's point about getting in more, helping those emerging leaders and especially people of color, bringing them up the ladder as well. So I think mentorship programs offered between either young people and their role models or even within the workplace itself could help a lot. And I think one of the challenges facing the realm of mentorship right now is kind of a misalignment in incentives. And sometimes people just, you do it to check off a box. But I think there has to be a real like invested interest in helping someone grow and helping someone succeed. And when we do that, I think it's through challenging your mentee to take those exploratory leaps in their learning and encouraging them to ask those questions, which I find that women don't always do. Not just like asking the questions, but being comfortable and confident enough to ask to get that role on a project, whether or not they are qualified enough in their perspective. And I think one of the things that differs, like Mike was saying, between women and men is I think the ability to learn on the spot. Everyone has that, but we don't really acknowledge as females that, hey, we can learn this and it's okay if we don't know it yet, and we wait until we know everything.
Yeah.
So I think that's where mentorship can come in, and hearing from the experiences and advice of someone that you really look up to can make a huge difference in your trajectory. And I, as a young woman in tech, that would be very valuable, and knowing a lot of my friends that would be interested in getting into the space.
That's great. Yeah. Mentorship is a huge one. And actually, ensuring that your mentorship is inclusive and equitable as a company is, and you touched on that as well, the nuances of making sure that those kinds of initiatives serve everyone. While we have people in the room, if they wanted to hire you in the future, what, from your perspective, what do you need from a company? What do you want to see? What's the deal breaker for your future company? Because I know that, younger generations, their requirements are changing. So, what is it that you need from your future employer as a deal breaker?
Yeah, so there's a lot, and I think the values of our generation are very different than the values of maybe older generations in terms of what we want to see in the workplace. So I think a similar quality that I've seen amongst my friends and people that I've spoken to in my generation about what we looked for in companies was that focus on the corporate social responsibility aspect of things. I don't think it should just be one branch of a company and not intertwined into everything that we do. So I think that impact really matters to people. And what I really love that Google does is this 80-20 rule. So 80% of your time will go towards the interest of the company and pushing it forward, but 20% you can either work on a passion project. Again, it should make sense within the context of the company, or working on a social impact project that you really care about. And I know one person at Google that traveled to the Arctic and was focused on providing Google STEM education to Inuit communities in Canada. So I thought that was amazing. And I think that's what a lot of young people really appreciate. And it's that sense of contribution to their communities and the world.
Yeah.
And being able to do that with the help of a company and together on a collaborative mission to help drive some change in the world. And I think the second thing is culture. And oftentimes it's that culture that overweighs salaries a lot, at least what I've heard from my friends and what I value. So it's going to a place where you feel like you're at home, you're excited to wake up every day and pursue the job that or career path that you're interested in. That can make a huge difference. And the people that you work with as well make a huge difference in terms of whether you feel welcome at that company and whether you enjoy going there every single day. So it's that kindness and that supportive atmosphere that a lot of people value quite a bit.
Yeah, and I heard it worded, what you were talking about there reminded me of a quote by Verne Myers. She's the Chief Diversity and Inclusion and Equity Woman at Netflix. She's pretty cool, and she described it as diversity is being invited to the party, inclusion is being asked to dance, and belonging is feeling like you can choose the playlist. So it's that culture of, you know, you feel like you can suggest things, you can do what you want to do, and you're still a valued part of contributing to their business. Wonderful. Thank you, Ria. Thank you for sharing. Very excited to see what you do and where you end up, but thank you once more. A question to everyone, all of you. One of the kind of core International Women's Day themes this year is #choose to challenge. I am sure many of us have seen that floating around the social medias the last day or so. Choose to challenge, I suppose, for me is really about, from my own personal understanding, is about challenging kind of internal bias, challenging why we think in a certain way, why I might act in a certain way, and how that plays into the workplace. I wanted to ask all of you, first of all, what responsibility do people, privileged enough to find themselves in leadership have to challenge the way things are done, the way things are happening? And maybe if you had an example of a time that you think you have challenged something or someone has challenged something for you, that would be great. So I might come to Amanda, if you don't mind me throwing you on the spot first.
No, that's fine. I actually also participated yesterday in a video program that we at the city did. The video is about the same question. And I think for me, the choose to challenge has been to challenge myself and actually drop the imposter syndrome and step up to the plate and lead. So not worry about what anybody else thinks. Carry on with what I think is the right thing to do it with authenticity, to do it with integrity, and just to step up and lead. And I think that takes more confidence than we give ourselves credit for. And that's been the challenge for me, definitely.
Amazing.
Very inspiring to hear, Ria. Thinking about myself 30 years ago, I hope that you are entering a very different workplace and listening to your 3 steps to belonging. The fact that we may actually have got to a level of diversity, maybe not quite where we want it to be, but we may be getting there, that inclusion is definitely on the table and belonging can't be too far off is really important, I think. So I hope it works out well for you, Ria.
Thank you for sharing. Mike, choose to challenge, kind of, I suppose, maybe, what you're choosing to challenge this year and as a leader yourself.
Yeah, I mean, I've got an example in my own business where we had to stop and really look at ourselves last year, and we had an imbalance, certainly at a decision-making level, and that resulted in us very quickly taking a highly experienced man from a leadership position, who we had a very ethical exit of that, and we hired 2 very ambitious young women to come onto the leadership team, and that's been really game changing for us, and really exciting. So that's sort of one example. Then I think as well, having been in and around the startup community for quite some time, the challenging those those accelerators, those funds, to really look at their apportionment of where the funding is going in the startup world. Startups founded by women, co-founded equally. I think then there's work that needs to go in there, and maybe that's at a level of how you can receive investments, how you're taxed, those sorts of things. But I think that's a great opportunity to challenge the next generation of owners, because we're seeing so many more companies started. It's it's not. I don't think we're going to see huge companies owning the space. It's so the entry requirements now are so low, and some of the rewards potentially so big that it's an exciting place to be, but it has to be a fair and equal place to be.
Yeah, great, thanks. And that also reminded me, as leaders of companies can also be thinking about, their supply chain, their wider, the companies they're working with, where they're outsourcing to, and thinking about not just your own, makeup, but who are you partnering with, who are you represented by? And yeah, that made me think of that as well. Thank you, Mike. I am going to move on to Ashanti. Choose to challenge. What are you choosing to challenge, or examples of where that's happened that you've seen it work out well?
Thank you. I mean, this choose to challenge hashtag for me is quite ironic, really, because quite often within the workplace, women of colour are labelled as challenging, and sometimes if you speak up, you are told that you are challenging. And so I think it's very ironic that that is the hashtag this year. We're being encouraged to challenge, but the reality is sometimes you don't always benefit from doing so. And so for me, my choice this year is to continue doing the work that I do, because quite often I am the only woman of colour in the space. And sometimes you're in environments where these might be new conversations, or very uncomfortable conversations for individuals around you. So my personal challenge, I guess, is to keep showing up, because I also understand that my mere visibility is in itself a challenge to the status quo we have in the workplace today.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Ashanti. That's that's correct, and it's one of them. We think about microaggressions. For anyone in the room that doesn't know, what microaggressions are, it's the way that we might subconsciously act, or the things we might say that really affect someone or are towards someone's particular identity. And you're right, Ashanti, the conversations around how we treat and how we talk about women of colour, particularly in leadership positions, there is an irony there in the theme this year. Ria, choose to challenge. Is there something you're challenging particularly this year, or do you think there's something leaders should be challenging?
For sure. I mean, echoing Amanda's sentiments, I think we should always continue to choose to challenge ourselves in terms of what we believe we can accomplish, and especially in the world of entrepreneurship, you're constantly doing that every day. And I think for everyone watching, there are a lot of people that have brilliant ideas, but I think it's taking action on them. That's the second leap that you should take. So if you do have something, I'd encourage you to go for it, because something that I love is you either win or you learn. And it's okay to fail on those first couple ideas. And I did with my first startup. So it's just a learning experience, and it's a journey that I think, you should embrace. And the second thing is, as leaders, I think we also have a responsibility to not only challenge ourselves, but challenge others. So sometimes you won't always have the people under you taking that extra leap and asking to work on that difficult project. So if there's someone that you see that is an emerging leader, and you would like to challenge them to develop their skills and to grow, maybe assigning them to that project or initiative that will challenge them a little bit, and then encourage them to push outside of their comfort zones as well, and challenging yourself to see how you can help others. And I think the last thing as a call to action is, if you're in the audience, I think everyone also has 10 minutes in their free time. And what I kind of like to do in reaching out to mentors that I like and role models that I look up to is literally just message like 50 people on LinkedIn, and at least one person will respond. And it's just challenging yourself to take that leap and go for it and ask. So
Yeah.
that's something that can have a tangible impact on your life and your trajectory in the short term that I would say is very valuable.
Amazing. Thank you, Ria. And you've very swiftly moved on to our final question for me. So thank you for sharing a call to action for everyone that's listening today. Ashanti, I know that you have a very filled schedule today, so I'm going to come to you first. I'm going to ask all of our panelists to share a call to action, something really tangible, something really practical that everyone in this room, this digital room, can leave, think about, go and do. You know, we all have a role. Sometimes it's systemic, sometimes it's organizational, sometimes it's individual, but we do all have a role to play in learning about equity and in getting women to leadership. You might be a senior manager, you might be entry level, you might be in any team, but we all do have a part to play. So Ashanti, your closing call to action for everyone listening in now would be wonderful if you don't mind sharing.
Sure, I would say ask somebody, if you're a manager in particular or a leader, ask somebody who is not in your peer group, not in the management team, what could I do differently to make your experience of this workplace different?
Perfect. Thank you. Very practical. And in case we don't get to say goodbye, thank you for joining us, Ashanti. Good luck with your day of IWD again. I'm going to come to you, Mike, next. Your call to action for our staff here today.
You see the sun just come through, like you said.
I know, I'm being blinded by it.
Call to action. I think I would frame it as you know, try and get the foundations right, ensure that gender equality initiatives involve women and men as active and equal partners, and get that framing and messaging right. You know, treat it as a critical societal and business issue, not a women's issue. It's that combination. So, you know, we sometimes forget how important the positioning, the promotion, the marketing is of these things. And my first 10 years of my career was in marketing, and always fall back into that of how important it can be. It's disruptive, of course, at other times, but yeah, getting that framing right is really important.
Yeah. Great. So from Ashanti, ask someone if you're a manager, and from Mike, really getting the foundation right and involving everyone in kind of moving forward. Amanda, call to action.
Okay, I'm going to encourage everybody to get involved in the open technology communities. We heard from Ashanti how trust and transparency was critical to feeling that sense of belonging and inclusion. And that's what we're all about. That's what's fundamental, whether we're looking at software, hardware, data. They're a very welcoming environment. They also allow you to engage internationally in different communities. So whether you are 16 or 60, I would encourage you to take part and go and get on with it.
Wonderful. Thank you, Amanda. And finally, Ria, before we close up, what is your, you've given your call to action. How could I forget? You very swiftly led us on to our call to actions. Sorry, Ria. Thank you very much, everyone, for sharing. And I suppose, thank you so much for joining us today. And International Women's Day and this whole week is such a busy time, and you've all been phenomenal at sharing and joining us. So thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed your time with us as much as I'm sure everyone enjoyed having you. I guess for everyone that's listening, that is our panel discussion over. I want to thank everyone once again for taking the time out today. These are really important conversations. They are necessary conversations. We've talked a lot about educating, self-awareness, uncomfortable conversations, you know, learning outside your own groups, and really challenging our own bias. So I hope everyone had something to take away. We haven't had any questions that I can see, but if anyone does think of something, please do send me an email or a Teams message, and I will email it to our panelists. I know they would be happy to address anything that comes through. But once again, to everyone, thank you so much. I hope that you enjoy the rest of your International Women's Day week campaign. We have lots of emails coming out, lots of film suggestions, podcast suggestions, amazing women to highlight. So I hope you enjoy, and thanks again to our panelists. Have a wonderful rest of Tuesday and rest of week, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Thanks, Amanda. Bye, Ria.